In the damp, raw air of the underground cavern dug into the chalk hills of Buckinghamshire, torchlight dances. Shadows on the walls take on bizarre, frightening outlines, resembling either demons or ancient satyrs. Somewhere deep in the cave, monotonous chanting echoes, interrupted by the clinking of glasses and women's laughter, which reverberates from the stone vaults. This place is hidden from the eyes of ordinary mortals. The noise of the outside world does not reach it, and entirely different laws apply here. In the center of this subterranean sanctuary, among people whose faces are hidden by masks or hoods, stands a figure that seems strangely familiar, yet utterly alien in this den. A stout, no longer young man with a penetrating gaze and a calm half-smile on his lips. The whole world knows him as a virtuous scientist, the author of wise aphorisms, and a tamer of heavenly lightning. But here, in the gloom of the English estate, Benjamin Franklin appears in a different guise. He is not merely an observer, he is part of a mystery that will excite the imagination of historians for centuries. What was one of the founding fathers of a great democracy doing in a den of debauchery and occult games of the British aristocracy? Was he a sincere participant in these dark masses, or did a cold spy's calculation, playing the most dangerous game of his life, hide behind his glass of wine? To understand this, we will have to descend into the darkness, where not only a depraved reputation but also high politics were born, and follow this amazing man from the gloomy caves of England to the shining salons of Paris, where the fates of empires were decided not on battlefields, but in boudoirs and at card tables. The history we are accustomed to seeing in school textbooks often paints portraits of great people in a single color. Benjamin Franklin, in the popular consciousness, has solidified into the image of a respectable old man in glasses, flying a kite into a stormy sky or printing useful advice for thrifty farmers. This image is Poor Richard, modest, hard-working, moderate in all things. But the truth is that this image was Franklin's most brilliant invention. Behind the facade of a preacher of frugality hid a complex man whose life was full of contradictions, passions, and secret maneuvers. He was a high-degree Freemason, a sophisticated diplomat, a lover of luxury, and an admirer of female beauty, who even in his 70s managed to charm the most brilliant ladies of Europe. His biography is not a straight line of ascent to virtue, but a tangled labyrinth where morality often gave way to pragmatism, and personal weaknesses became tools of a larger game. The mid-18th century was a time of paradoxes. The age of Enlightenment, proclaiming the cult of reason, coexisted with a fascination for mysticism and secret societies. Rationalism went hand in hand with hedonism, and Franklin, more than anyone else, embodied the spirit of this era. He was a perfect mirror of the age, reflecting both its light and its shadows. To understand how exactly this man managed to redraw the world map, we need to forget the textbook old man and see a living, flesh-and-blood, cunning, and incredibly charming player who felt at home in a humble printing house, a royal palace, and a secret dungeon. When Franklin arrived in London in the 1750s, he was already a celebrity. His experiments with electricity had made his name known in scientific circles, but his ambitions extended far beyond the laboratory. He arrived as a representative of the colonies, a loyal subject of the British Crown, genuinely believing in the unity of the empire. London at that time was the center of the world, a bustling, dirty, magnificent, and deeply corrupt city. And at the very heart of this elite corruption was Sir Francis Dashwood, an odious and attractive figure. Dashwood was not just a wealthy aristocrat. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the founder of a society that went down in history as the Hellfire Club, although the members themselves preferred to call themselves the Monks of Medmenham. It was a closed community that included the most influential people in Britain: politicians, poets, artists, and even clergymen. Their residence was a converted abbey on the banks of the Thames, and later, a system of caves on the West Wycombe estate. The club's motto, inscribed above the entrance, read, quote, "2. It was a challenge to Puritan morality, a manifesto of absolute freedom. Rumors of what happened behind the club's closed doors spread throughout London. There was talk of black masses, parodies of religious rituals, unbridled orgies, and the worship of pagan gods, Bacchus and Venus." Of course, popular rumor and pamphleteers greatly exaggerated the scale of Satanism. For enlightened aristocrats, it was more of a theatrical game, a way to thrill and relieve the tension of state affairs. But the atmosphere of licentiousness and disregard for social norms was quite real. And it was into this circle that Benjamin Franklin entered. What could the American moralist have in common with these jaded Sybarites, it would seem? However, documents and circumstantial evidence confirm Franklin was a frequent guest at Dashwood's estate. They worked together on revising the Book of Common Prayer, a project that itself seems absurd for the leader of a club of debauchees and a deist from the colonies, but which perfectly illustrates their intellectual closeness. Franklin felt surprisingly comfortable in this environment. He was attracted not so much by the debauchery as by the opportunity for informal communication with people who actually ran the empire. Here we encounter the first layer of conflict, the external political one. For Franklin, participating in elite gatherings, even those with a scandalous reputation, was a way to penetrate the center of decision-making. In the caves of West Wycombe, to the clinking of glasses, appointments of governors, tax laws, and military strategies were discussed. Franklin, a pragmatist to the core, understood. To influence politics, one must be where politicians loosen their ties. However, his presence there was ambivalent. On the one hand, he enjoyed the company of intellectuals and libertines. On the other, he always remained an outsider, a colonist. There is a version that Franklin might have used these meetings to gather compromising material or intelligence. In a world where personal secrets could cost careers, knowing who and how people entertained themselves in the Abbey was a powerful weapon. But one should not discount the fact that Franklin simply enjoyed this game. He loved hoaxes. He loved mysteries. The Masonic structure of the club was understandable and close to him. He himself was an active Mason and even served as Grand Master in Pennsylvania. Rituals, symbolism, hierarchy, all of this was part of his world. But hellfire added a sharp taste of forbidden fruit to it. Franklin's internal conflict during this period was even deeper. He lived in two worlds not only geographically, but also psychologically. In America remained his wife Deborah, a simple woman who was afraid to cross the ocean and managed his household. In London, Franklin lived in the house of the widow Margaret Stevenson, with whom he had, to put it mildly, very warm relations, effectively replacing family ties. His English family gave him the intellectual and emotional comfort he did not find at home. Here, he was a gentleman, a scholar, a social lion. He enjoyed attention, exquisite food, intelligent conversations. But somewhere deep down, tension was growing. His son, William, illegitimate but acknowledged and loved, was becoming more English than Benjamin himself. William sought to become part of the British establishment at all costs. and this ultimately led to their tragic rupture. Franklin saw how power corrupts, how cynical the British aristocracy was, and yet he himself was part of this system. He tried to sit on two chairs, to be a patriot of the colonies and a loyal servant of the king. This dichotomy could not last forever. His internal dilemma was a struggle between the desire to belong to high society and the understanding that this society was deeply sick and unjust towards his homeland. The third layer of conflict, the ideological one, unfolded in the realm of philosophy. The 18th century was a time of clash between old religious dogma and a new rational view of the world. Franklin was a deist. He believed in a creator but not in miracles, revelations, or church rituals. For him, God was the great architect who created the mechanism of the universe and left it to operate according to its own laws. This worldview allowed for the justification of many things. If God gave man reason and senses, then using them for pleasure is not a sin, as long as it doesn't harm others. The members of the Hellfire Club took this idea to its absolute extreme, turning it into hedonism. Franklin did not fall into extremes, but his philosophy was flexible. He believed that the quote, "zero" of the flesh were natural needs that should be regulated by reason, not by prohibitions. His famous list of 13 virtues included, quote, 1, but with the caveat, quote, 2. This formulation left enormous room for maneuver. Franklin's paradox was that he preached moderation, yet he himself was a man of enormous appetites for food, for knowledge, for life, and for women. He saw the hypocrisy of the church and opposed it with natural religion. In Dashwood's Caves, where church sacraments were parodied, Franklin saw not so much blasphemy as satire on prudery. It was a rebellion of intellect against dogma, even if expressed in such an extravagant form. The turning point that forever changed the trajectory of Franklin's life, and consequently the history of the world, did not occur in a cave, but in an official meeting hall. This event is known as the humiliation in the cockpit. In January 1774, Franklin appeared before the Privy Council in London. He was accused of intercepting and publishing letters from the governor of Massachusetts, in which the latter called for harsh measures against the colonists. Solicitor General Alexander Wedderburn spent an hour slandering Franklin in front of laughing lords. He called him a thief, a traitor, a man without honor. Franklin stood motionless, with a stone face, not uttering a word. He was wearing a Manchester-made velvet suit. In that hour, the British Franklin died. The man who had spent years building bridges, who drank wine with Dashwood and tried to reconcile the colonies with the mother country, realized, to these people, he would always be a hick, a servant, a subhuman. Illusions shattered. A revolutionary, not a loyalist, walked out of the hall. The cold fury born that day became the fuel for his subsequent actions. He swore that he would make these arrogant lords pay, and he kept his word. He carefully preserved that very velvet suit in his closet, to wear it only once, many years later, on the day of his greatest triumph. Franklin's transformation was complete. When he went to Paris 2 years later to ask for help for the young American Republic, he was no longer the man who had tried to fit in London. Now he decided to play ahead of the curve. He understood that the French, raised on Rousseau's ideas, expected something special from an American: naturalness, simplicity, the noble savage. And Franklin, that most cunning intellectual, that regular at London clubs, put on the mask of a simpleton. He refused the powdered wig that all respectable people of that time wore. He put on simple brown clothes and, a brilliant touch, a fur hat. In this guise he appeared at Versailles. The effect was that of a bombshell. Paris went mad. Aristocrats, tired of complex etiquette and silks, saw in him the embodiment of ancient wisdom and natural purity. His images were everywhere, on snuff boxes, fans, mantel clocks. Women fainted with delight, men hung on his every word. Franklin understood perfectly what he was doing. He wrote to his daughter, "Your father has become the fashion." He used his popularity as a battering ram, breaking down the doors of the royal treasury. But Paris became for Franklin not only a field of diplomatic battle, but also the arena of his last, perhaps most vivid, romantic adventures. He was already over 70. He suffered from gout and kidney stones, but his energy, his charm, and his libido remained unchanged. He settled in the suburb of Passy, which was then a rural paradise, and here began the period of his Parisian sins, which, however, were so elegant that the word sin seems too crude. Two women took center stage in his heart and in his strategy, Madame Briand and Madame Helvetius. Madame Briand, a talented musician, was much younger than him. Their relationship was a strange mixture of flirtation, paternal care, and sensual tension. Franklin wrote her playful letters, calling her his daughter, but at the same time openly hinting at a desire for greater intimacy. They spent hours playing chess, while Madame Briand took a bath, a custom quite permissible in French high society of the time, but shocking for a Puritan. Franklin skillfully balanced on the edge, never quite crossing it, but maintaining the degree of tension. With Madame Helvetius, the widow of the famous philosopher, relations were different. She was a mature, eccentric woman who hosted one of the most brilliant salons. She had 18 cats and many admirers. Franklin was captivated by her wit and freedom of manners. He even proposed to her, which she, laughing, rejected, saying that she did not want to betray the memory of her husband. In response, Franklin wrote one of his most witty and audacious works, The Elysium Dream. In it, he describes how he enters Elysium, heaven, meets Madame Helvetius's deceased husband there, and learns that he has already married Franklin's former wife. If so, Franklin concludes, then let us take revenge on them here, on Earth. This was a brilliant literary game, a high-flying flirtation. These bagatelles, as Franklin himself called them, small essays and stories that he printed on his own small printing press in Passy, were a powerful weapon. They charmed the French elite, made them love this strange American, and through him, America itself. He seduced France not only as a man seduces a woman, but also as a politician seduces a nation. Every smile, every kiss of the hand, every witty answer brought closer the delivery of rifles, gunpowder, and ultimately a fleet and army, without which Washington's victory would have been impossible. The culmination of this incredible game came when the war in America drew to a close. Britain was exhausted, France was ruined by aid to its allies, but full of pride. Peace negotiations began, and here Franklin again proved himself a grand master. He was in Paris, surrounded by British spies. His own secretary, Edward Bancroft, was a paid agent of London, and Franklin probably suspected this but used it for his own purposes. He needed to conclude peace with Britain without quarreling with France, and at the same time negotiate independence and vast territories for the USA. This was an impossible task. The French minister Vergennes wanted to keep America weak and dependent. The British wanted to break up the alliance of allies. Franklin maneuvered between them with the virtuosity of a tightrope walker. He violated Congress's instructions by beginning separate negotiations with the British. He used his old connections, his knowledge of British psychology, and when the treaty was ready, he managed to present it to Vergennes in such a way that, although angered, he did not break off relations, and even issued a new loan. On the day the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, Franklin performed his symbolic act of retribution. He retired to his dressing room and retrieved the very velvet suit in which he had been humiliated in the cockpit nearly 10 years earlier. He wore it to the signing ceremony. None of those present understood the significance of this gesture, but for Franklin, it was a moment of truth. The circle was complete. The man who had been called a traitor was now dictating the terms of peace to the most powerful empire on the planet. His sins, his cunning, his masks, all of it worked. The virtuous Poor Richard would never have been able to achieve this. This was done by Franklin the Freemason, Franklin the gambler, Franklin the seducer. The resonance of this story for us today is colossal. We are accustomed to demanding perfect moral purity from public figures. We seek compromising material. We condemn weaknesses. But Franklin's example teaches us that history is not made by angels, but by living people. Moreover, sometimes it is precisely a person's ability to be flexible, multifaceted, the ability to understand and use human vices, that becomes the key to great achievements. Franklin showed that diplomacy is the art of the possible, and in this art, personal charm and understanding of psychology are more important than cannons. His lessons are relevant in any era. Soft power often triumphs over brute force, and image is capital that can be converted into real power. He taught us that patriotism does not have to be gloomy and fanatical. It can be cheerful, witty, and cosmopolitan. His sins in Paris brought more benefit to America than the prayers of thousands of Puritans. The paradox of Franklin is that he, being perhaps the most secular and least religious of the Founding Fathers, became the patron saint of American entrepreneurship and self-improvement. He left us not only the lightning rod and bifocals, but also a model of how one can construct oneself. He himself was his greatest invention. At the end of his life, returning to Philadelphia, suffering from pain, he finished his memoirs, carefully editing the past, smoothing out rough edges, turning a turbulent life into an edifying story. But we should remember him not as a bronze monument, but as that man in the cave with a torch, as the old man in a fur hat whispering compliments to a French countess. Concluding our story, we mentally return to those very caves of West Wycombe. Tourists today wander through them, listening to scary ghost stories. But the true spirit of this place is not a ghost, but an idea. The idea that human nature is immeasurably broad, that a sage and a libertine, a patriot and a cosmopolitan, an ascetic and a gourmet can coexist within one person. Benjamin Franklin was not afraid of his darkness. He explored it just as he explored electricity. And, perhaps, precisely because he knew the hellfire of passions and intrigues, he was able to bring the light of freedom to his compatriots. His life was a grand experiment, and, looking at the modern world, one can confidently say, the experiment succeeded. The final thought that remains with us is simple and complex at the same time. Perfection is unattainable, but the path to it, full of mistakes, falls, and pleasures, is life itself. And as Franklin himself wrote in the epitaph he composed for himself long before his death, the body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more, in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author. The great editor of his destiny placed the final period, but we continue to read the text of his life to this day.